They say power makes people forget faces, forget names, forget the damage they leave behind. But some of us don't get that luxury. For 10 years, I watched the man who destroyed my family rise higher and higher on magazine covers, business panels, and billion-dollar deals. Tonight, he's not a headline. He's sitting right in front of me at table 4, complaining about a glass of wine that costs more than my monthly rent. He doesn't recognize me. He doesn't know my name. He has no idea that the woman refilling his water is the daughter of the man he crushed. And here's the thing. I didn't come here by accident. I know something about him, something buried so deep it could bring his entire empire down. But exposing the truth won't just destroy him, it could destroy me too. So the question is, when the person who ruined your life finally puts his fate in your hands, do you choose justice or revenge? Because tonight, time is finally running out for both of us. The alarm clock didn't so much ring as it did groan, a mechanical rasp that cut through the thin grey light of a Manhattan November. Clara Martinez didn't move immediately. She lay still under a quilt that had lost most of its loft years ago, listening to the radiator hiss and clank, a rhythmic, metallic heartbeat that served as the soundtrack to her poverty. The air in the room was sharp, carrying the faint metallic scent of old pipes and the lingering ghost of the toast she'd burnt 2 days ago. Every morning began with the same internal tally. She didn't count her breaths or her dreams. She counted her debts. $600 for the back rent, $300 for the miracle of electricity. And then there was the larger number, the one that sat in the back of her mind like a lead weight at the bottom of a lake, $200,000. It was the inheritance her father had left her, not in gold or property, but in the wreckage of a life dismantled by men who played with numbers like they were toy soldiers. Clara sat up, her feet hitting the cold linoleum floor. The chill traveled up her spine, a familiar jolt. She moved through her ritual with the efficiency of a soldier. The bathroom was a closet-sized space where the mirror was flecked with silver rot at the edges, distorting her reflection. She looked at herself, really looked, for a moment. At 24, there were fine lines around her eyes that shouldn't have been there yet. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight, severe bun, a style that wasn't meant to be flattering but functional. In her world, beauty was a liability. Invisibility was a shield. She dressed in her uniform, a crisp white button-down, black slacks and a vest. The fabric was cheap polyester, but she ironed it every night until the creases were sharp enough to cut. She lived in a world where the people she served could smell a lack of discipline from a mile away. The commute was 40 minutes of being pressed against other tired bodies on the 6 train. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the subway door, watching the tunnel lights flicker by like a film strip of her own failures. She remembered a different version of herself, a girl who had once lived in a brownstone with high ceilings and a piano that her father played on Sunday afternoons. She remembered the smell of his expensive tobacco and the way he used to laugh, a deep, booming sound that made her feel like nothing in the world could ever go wrong. Then came the memory of the silence, the day the laughter stopped, the day the men in suits arrived and the piano was hauled out by movers who didn't care about the music it held. By 4 p.m., Clara was standing at the entrance of the glass house. The restaurant was an architectural marvel of steel and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the park. It was a place designed to make the wealthy feel like they were floating above the city, insulated from the noise and the dirt by layers of tempered crystal. Andre, the floor manager, a man whose ego was as inflated as the prices on the wine list, adjusted his cuffs as he approached her. He didn't look at her face, he looked at her shoes. Martinez, table 4 is a VIP tonight. If I see a single fingerprint on the crystal, it's your last shift. Do you understand? I understand, Andre, Clara said. Her voice was a low, steady thrum. She had learned long ago that if you spoke without emotion, people treated you like furniture, and furniture didn't get into trouble. She spent the next hour in a trance of preparation. She polished the silver with a white cloth, her movements rhythmic and precise. The dining room began to fill. The air changed, transitioning from the sterile scent of lemon wax to the heavy, layered aromas of expensive perfume, seared wagyu and aged oak. The low hum of conversation rose, a cacophony of deal-making, gossip, and the clinking of gold watches against marble tabletops. Clara moved through the room like a ghost. She filled water glasses before they were half empty. She cleared plates before the diners even realized they were finished. She was a master of the peripheral vision, knowing exactly when a guest was about to signal for the check. Then, at 5:15 p.m., the heavy brass doors at the front swung open. A draft of cold November air cut through the warmth of the restaurant, carrying the scent of rain and wet pavement. Clara was refilling a carafe at the side station when she heard it. The voice. It was a voice she hadn't heard in 10 years, yet it was more familiar to her than her own. It was a voice that had echoed through her nightmares, a deep, resonant baritone with a slight, clipped edge of boredom. "I don't care about the merger details, Marcus. I want the liquidation report on my desk by morning." Clara's hand jolted. A splash of ice water hit the marble, the droplets scattering like diamonds. Her heart, which usually beat with a slow, dull thud, suddenly hammered against her ribs. Her vision blurred for a split second, the bright lights of the chandeliers fracturing into jagged shards. She turned her head, slowly, as if her neck were made of rusting iron. Walking toward the host stand was a man who looked like he had been carved from the very shadows he created. Julian Thorne. He was taller than she remembered, his frame lean and encased in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her apartment building. His hair was darker, touched with silver at the temples now, and his face was a landscape of sharp angles and cold, piercing eyes. He didn't walk. He conquered the space he moved through. To the rest of the room, he was a titan of industry, a man whose name was synonymous with hostile takeover. To Clara, he was the man who had stood in her father's study 10 years ago and calmly explained that their lives no longer belonged to them. "Table 4, Andre whispered, appearing at Clara's elbow, his voice frantic. "He's here. Move, Martinez, now." Clara's legs felt like lead. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, to drop the carafe and bolt out the back door into the rainy night. But the debt held her in place. The $200,000 held her in place. She took a breath, the air tasting of ozone and expensive cologne. She wiped the spill on the counter with a cloth, her fingers trembling so violently she had to clench them into a fist. She smoothed her vest, touched the bun at the back of her head, and stepped into the light. As she approached table 4, Julian Thorne was already seated. He was looking at his phone, his thumb sliding across the screen with a predatory grace. A younger man, his assistant, sat opposite him, frantically scribbling notes. Clara stood at the edge of the table. The distance between them was less than 3 feet. She could see the fine weave of his tie. She could see the way his pulse jumped in the hollow of his throat. She waited for the recognition to hit. She waited for him to look up, to gasp, to see the ghost of the man he destroyed staring back at him through his daughter's eyes. "Sparkling or still?" she asked. Her voice was a miracle of forced stability, though it felt like it was being squeezed out of a tightening throat. Julian didn't look up. He didn't even pause his scrolling. "Still, and a bottle of the '09 Montrachet. Keep the glasses full. I'm in a hurry." He said it with the casual dismissal one might give to a voice-activated speaker. He didn't look at her face. He didn't look at her hands. To him, she was a shadow in a black vest. She was a utility, a non-entity. He had no idea who she was. Clara felt a strange, cold sensation wash over her. It wasn't relief. It was something sharper, something more dangerous. For 10 years, she had carried the weight of his name like a brand. She had memorized his face from business magazines, tracking his ascent as her own life spiraled into the dirt. She had imagined this confrontation 1,000 times, usually ending in her shouting her father's name until his ears bled. But this invisibility was a different kind of power. She reached out and placed the water glass on the table. Her hand was steady now. She watched his reflection in the polished surface of the table. He was leaning back, a slight frown marring his forehead, looking tired in a way that wasn't just about a lack of sleep. "Certainly, sir," Clara said, the words tasting like ash. "I'll bring the wine immediately." She turned and walked away, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. As she reached the safety of the kitchen doors, she leaned her back against the cool stainless steel. Her lungs finally expanded, drawing in a sharp, ragged breath. The man who had destroyed her family was sitting at table 4. He was within reach, and he was completely, utterly oblivious. A slow, dark smile touched the corners of Clara's mouth, one that didn't reach her eyes. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a ghost who had finally found her way back into the house of the living, and she knew exactly how to haunt it. The kitchen bell rang, a sharp, metallic strike that signaled the start of the hunt. Clara returned to the table 5 minutes later, the bottle of Montrachet nestled in a silver ice bucket. She moved with a newfound fluidity, a predator masking as prey. Julian Thorne was now deep in conversation with his assistant, their voices hushed but intense. "If we leak the acquisition figures before the board meeting, the stock price will crater," the assistant whispered, his eyes darting around the room. Julian leaned forward, the candlelight catching the amber depths of his eyes. "That's the point, Marcus. We need it to crater. I want to buy them back for pennies on the dollar. It's not a leak. It's an adjustment." Clara positioned the bucket on the stand. She began the ritual of opening the wine, her ears tuned to the frequency of his voice. Every word he spoke was a piece of a puzzle she had been trying to solve for a decade. He was discussing the destruction of another company, another family, another father. As the cork popped with a muted thud, Julian finally glanced up. It was a fleeting look, meant to acknowledge the service, but for a heartbeat, their eyes met. Clara held his gaze. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She waited for the spark of memory, the flicker of a 10-year-old girl standing in a hallway while he walked out with her father's dignity in his briefcase. But Julian Thorne's eyes remained cold and empty of recognition. He looked at her eyes the way he might look at a crack in the sidewalk, something to be noted, then stepped over. "Is there something else?" he asked, his voice sharpening with a hint of irritation. "No, sir," Clara replied, her voice as smooth as the wine she was pouring. "Just ensuring the vintage is to your satisfaction." He took a sip, nodded curtly, and turned back to his assistant, dismissing her once again. Clara retreated to the shadows of the waiter station. She pulled a small, leather-bound notepad from her pocket, the one she used to track tips and orders. But she didn't write down a wine price. She wrote down 3 words: Vanguard Holdings, liquidation. The weight of the ashes was still there, heavy in her chest. But for the first time in 10 years, the fire was beginning to stir underneath them. As the night wore on, the restaurant grew louder, but table 4 remained an island of cold, calculated silence. And Clara Martinez stood in the dark, watching the man she hated, waiting for him to say just one more word. The soft click of Julian's lighter as he prepared to leave was the only signal she needed. The game had begun. The night did not end when Clara's shift did. It followed her out of the revolving brass doors of the glass house and into the biting New York wind. The city at midnight was a different beast, gritty, loud, and indifferent. As she walked toward the subway, the neon lights of Midtown blurred into long, jagged streaks of red and blue against the wet asphalt. She could still feel the weight of the wine bottle in her palm. She could still hear the dry, clipped cadence of Julian Thorne's voice. Table 4. It was as if a ghost had reached out from the past and tapped her on the shoulder, not to comfort her, but to remind her that the debt was still unpaid. When she finally reached her apartment, she didn't turn on the overhead light. The glow from the street lamp outside filtered through the grimy window, casting long, barred shadows across the floor. She sat at her small kitchen table, her coat still on, and pulled the leather-bound notebook from her pocket. She opened it to the page where she had written Vanguard Holdings. Underneath it, she began to write, her pen scratching against the paper in the silence. She wrote down every detail she could remember. The color of Julian's tie, the way he ignored his assistant's nervous stutter, the specific numbers mentioned in the liquidation talk. She closed her eyes and saw her father. She saw him sitting in his worn leather armchair, his hands shaking as he looked at a pile of legal documents. "He's a raider, Clara," her father had whispered that final night. "He doesn't build things. He finds the cracks in what others have built, and he pries them open until everything falls apart." Clara's grip on the pen tightened until her knuckles turned white. Julian Thorne had pried open her father's life. He'd taken a man of integrity and turned him into a headline about a failed venture. Now Julian was sitting at her table, and the cracks were his to hide. "I see you now, Julian," she whispered to the empty room. "And I'm going to find the crack." The following week, Clara arrived at the restaurant an hour early. She didn't go to the break room. Instead, she went to Andre's office. Andre was a man who valued two things: punctuality and the illusion of perfection. He was currently obsessing over a seating chart for a gala event, his forehead creased with the stress of placing two rival hedge fund managers on opposite sides of the room. "Andre," Clara said, her voice soft but firm. He didn't look up. "Not now, Martinez. I have a headache the size of the Empire State." "I want table 4, she said, permanently. Andre paused, his pen hovering over the chart. He looked up, his eyes narrowing behind his designer frames. "Table 4 is Thorne's table. He's a difficult man. Most of the staff are terrified of him." "Why would you want the headache?" "Because I know how he likes his coffee," Clara lied easily, "and I know he prefers silence. Most of the other servers try to make conversation. I won't. I can manage him so you don't have to hear him complain." Andre studied her. He saw the severe bun, the ironed uniform, the lack of a smile. To him, Clara was the perfect machine. "Fine," he waved a hand dismissively. "He's your problem now. Just don't let him leave a bad review. The owner is sensitive about the Thorne types." Clara nodded and left the office. She had secured her vantage point. For the next 5 nights, the pattern was the same. Julian Thorne arrived at 7 p.m. He was always accompanied by Marcus, his high-strung assistant, or a revolving door of men in suits who looked like they were walking to their own executions. Clara became his shadow. She learned that he never looked at the menu because he always ordered the same thing: a dry-aged ribeye, medium rare, and a side of bitter greens. He never touched the bread. He drank exactly 2 glasses of red wine, never 3, and finished with an espresso that he took in 3 precise sips. But she looked closer than anyone else. She noticed that he always arrived with his coat buttoned, even when the restaurant was uncomfortably warm. She noticed that when he thought no one was looking, he would press his thumb and forefinger to the bridge of his nose, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second too long to be a mere blink. And she noticed his hands. They were the hands of a man who controlled billions, yet they had a subtle, nearly imperceptible tremor. He compensated for it by gripping his glass firmly or tucking his hand into his pocket when he spoke. To a casual observer, he was the picture of power. To Clara, he was a man holding himself together by sheer force of will. One Tuesday, the restaurant was unusually quiet. A heavy fog had rolled in off the Hudson, turning the windows into opaque sheets of grey. Julian was alone. He didn't have Marcus with him to take notes. He just had a stack of documents and a burner phone that sat on the table like a live grenade. Clara approached with his espresso. The scent of the dark roast mingled with the faint, expensive musk of his cologne, something that smelled like cedar and cold rain. As she set the cup down, his phone buzzed. Julian didn't pick it up. He just stared at the screen. The name on the display was Dr. Aris. Clara lingered, her hand adjusting the silver spoon by a fraction of an inch. She felt the tension radiating off him, a cold, vibrating energy. "Is there something else, sir?" she asked. Julian didn't answer immediately. He looked at the phone, then slowly up at her. For the first time, he really looked at her. His eyes were a startling, piercing grey, the color of the Atlantic before a storm. "You're very efficient," he said. His voice was low, stripped of its usual boardroom bite. It sounded tired. "I don't believe I've had to ask you for a single thing all week." "That is my job, Mr. Thorne," Clara replied. Her heart was a frantic bird in her chest, but her face remained a mask of marble. "Most people in your position want to be seen," Julian said, his gaze drifting back to the documents. "They want a tip or a favor or a story to tell their friends. You seem content to be a ghost." "Ghosts see more than the living, sir," she said. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. It was a slip, a crack in her own armor. She held her breath, waiting for him to snap at her, to demand a different server, to realize that the girl from 10 years ago was standing right in front of him. Instead, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who recognized a fellow traveler in the dark. "I suppose they do," he murmured. He reached for his espresso, but as he did, his fingers betrayed him. The saucer clattered against the marble table, and a few dark drops of coffee splashed onto the white cuff of his shirt. He froze. His face went pale, a muscle jumping in his jaw. He stared at the stain as if it were a mortal wound. Without a word, Clara pulled a clean, damp linen cloth from her apron. She moved instinctively, leaning in to dab at the cuff. "Allow me, sir," she whispered. She took his wrist. His skin was burning hot, a sharp contrast to the cold rain she had imagined in his veins. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed down to that point of contact. She could feel the heavy throb of his pulse under her fingertips. It was fast, too fast for a man just sitting at a table. Julian didn't pull away. He watched her work, his breath hitching slightly. The silence between them was no longer the silence of service. It was the heavy, charged silence of two people who had suddenly become aware of each other's humanity. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Clara pulled back, tucking the cloth away. She felt a strange, dizzying sensation. She had spent a decade hating this man, building him up into a monster of mythic proportions, but monsters didn't have shaking hands. Monsters didn't have feverish skin. "I'll bring you a fresh espresso," she said, her voice trembling just enough for her to notice. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, her mind racing. She had the information she needed. She had seen the doctor's name. She had felt the tremor. She had the Vanguard secrets tucked away in her notebook. She had everything she needed to destroy him. So why did her hand feel like it was burning where she had touched him? By the second week, Clara's plan was in motion. She had used a burner phone of her own to contact an anonymous tip line for Vanguard Holdings' legal team. She had hinted that she had internal documents regarding Julian Thorne's liquidation strategy. The response had been near instant. They wanted a meeting. They offered consultation fees that would wipe out her father's debt in a single transaction. But as the day of the meeting approached, Clara found herself stalling. She spent her mornings in the public library, researching Julian Thorne, not as a raider, but as a person. She found old articles buried deep in the archives. She found a photo of him from 15 years ago, before he was the ghost of Wall Street. In the photo, he was standing next to a woman with a kind face, his wife. The headline read, "Thorne's Empire Built on Partnership." Then she found the later articles, the car accident, the death of his wife. The way he had systematically liquidated every asset they had owned together, as if he were trying to erase the very memory of his happiness. He hadn't always been a monster. He had been made into one, piece by piece, loss by loss. That night at the restaurant, the atmosphere was different. A gala was happening in the main ballroom, but Julian's corner of the bistro was dark and quiet. He looked worse. His skin had a translucent quality, and the shadows under his eyes were the color of bruises. He was looking at a small white pill bottle. He didn't open it. He just rolled it between his palms, over and over, a restless, mechanical motion. Clara approached with his wine. She poured the Montrachet with practiced ease, the golden liquid catching the candlelight. "You're late tonight, Mr. Thorne," she said. It was a bold move, an invitation to a conversation she shouldn't be having. Julian looked up. He didn't seem annoyed. He seemed almost relieved to hear her voice. The board meeting went long. "They're worried about the Vanguard acquisition. They think I'm losing my edge." "Are you?" Clara asked, her heart hammering. Julian looked at his hands, which were resting flat on the table to hide the shake. "I'm losing more than that, Clara." He used her name. The sound of it sent a jolt through her. He had seen her name tag, of course, but hearing it in his voice changed the molecular structure of the air. It wasn't a command. It was a confession. "Is that why you look at the doctor's calls and don't answer them?" she asked, her voice a mere breath. Julian's eyes snapped to hers. For a moment the Titan was back, the cold, dangerous man who could ruin lives with a pen stroke. "You're overstepping." "I told you, sir," Clara said, standing her ground. "Ghosts see more than the living. I see a man who is exhausted. I see a man who is fighting a war on two fronts, and one of them is his own body." The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Clara expected him to fire her. She expected him to ruin her right then and there. Instead, Julian let out a long, ragged breath. He slumped back into the leather chair, all the air seemingly leaving his lungs. "It's a neurological degenerative disorder," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Slow at first, then everything all at once. The doctors give me a year of functionality, if I'm lucky. Less if I don't stop. And will you stop?" Julian looked out the window at the flickering lights of the city he had conquered. "And do what? Sit in a penthouse and wait for the lights to go out?" "No, I'll die in the saddle, Clara. It's the only way I know how to exist." Clara looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see the man who killed her father. She saw a man who was already dead, just waiting for his heart to catch up. The hatred she had nurtured for 10 years didn't vanish, but it shifted. It became something heavier, something more complex. She thought of the meeting with Vanguard. She thought of the $200,000. She thought of the revenge she had tasted in her dreams. "Why me?" Julian asked suddenly. "Why do you stay and talk to me? I know I'm not an easy customer. I know what they say about me in the kitchen." Clara looked at the empty wineglass. She could tell him the truth. She could tell him she was the daughter of the man he broke. She could tell him she was the one who was going to sell his secrets to the highest bidder. "Because," she said, her voice steady, "I think you're the only person in this city who is as lonely as I am." Julian Thorne reached out. He didn't take her hand, but his fingers brushed the edge of her sleeve, a tentative, almost desperate gesture. "Stay a moment," he said. "Just stay until I finish the wine." Clara didn't move. She stood in the shadow of table 4, the calculated predator, becoming a silent witness to a Titan's fall. The rain began to lash against the glass, a rhythmic drumming that drowned out the rest of the world. She had the match in her hand, and the bridge was soaked in gasoline. All she had to do was drop it. But as she looked at Julian Thorne, she realized that the fire wouldn't just burn him. It would burn the only person who had truly seen her in a decade. The minute hand of the clock on the wall clicked forward. The meeting with Vanguard was in 12 hours. Clara watched Julian's chest rise and fall, and for the first time she felt the weight of the ashes not as a burden, but as a warning. The morning of the day that was supposed to change everything began with a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. Clara sat at her kitchen table, the yellowed light of the overhead bulb flickering with a dying buzz. In front of her lay two objects: her father's old silver watch, which had stopped ticking the day he died, and the burner phone she had used to contact Vanguard Holdings. 10 o'clock. That was the time of the meeting. In 3 hours, she could walk into a glass-walled office in Midtown, hand over the digital recorder and the notes she'd painstakingly gathered, and walk out with enough money to scrub her father's name clean of every debt. She could leave the bistro. She could move to a city where the air didn't taste like exhaust and regret. She could stop being a ghost. She picked up the phone. Her thumb hovered over the confirm button for the final meeting location. "Why do you stay and talk to me?" Julian's voice from the night before echoed in the small, cramped kitchen. It wasn't the voice of the man who had dismantled her life. It was the voice of a man standing at the edge of a different kind of abyss. Clara closed her eyes. She saw her father's face, but then it blurred, the sharp angles of Julian's features superimposing themselves over the memory. Both men were victims of time, one of a clock that ran out of money, the other of a body that was running out of time. The burner phone buzzed. A message from the Vanguard contact. "We are moving the location to the cafe across from the bistro. 10:15 sharp. Bring everything." Clara didn't reply. She felt a sudden, sharp nausea. Revenge, she realized, was supposed to feel like fire, cleansing and hot. Instead, it felt like swallowing cold iron. She stood up, walked to the sink, and splashed cold water on her face. She looked at her reflection. The dark circles under her eyes were deeper. She looked like a woman who was losing a war. "For you, Dad," she whispered. But the words felt hollow. She dressed for her shift, even though the meeting was hours away. She ironed her white shirt until the collar was like bone. She pulled her hair back so tightly it pulled at her temples. She needed to feel the constraint. She needed to feel the discipline. By 6:10 p.m., the storm that had been threatening the city all morning finally broke. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a deluge that turned the Manhattan streets into rivers of churning grey water. Inside the glass house, the atmosphere was electric. The wind howled against the reinforced glass, a low, mournful sound that made the diners uneasy. Julian Thorne was late. Clara found herself checking the door every time the brass handles turned. She told herself it was because she needed him there to finalize her resolve. She needed to see the monster again, to remind herself why she was going to destroy him tomorrow. The meeting had been pushed to the following morning after she claimed she needed one more night of surveillance. At 7:45 p.m. he arrived. He didn't have Marcus with him. He didn't have a briefcase. He walked through the doors, drenched, his charcoal overcoat heavy with water. He didn't wait for the host. He walked straight to table 4 and sank into the leather chair. Clara moved toward him before Andre could even signal her. As she got closer, she saw that Julian wasn't just wet. He was grey. A sickly, ashen hue had settled into his skin. His eyes were bloodshot, and his breathing was shallow. She didn't ask for his drink order. She didn't offer a menu. She simply leaned down and whispered, "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Thorne." Julian looked up at her. His pupils were dilated. He tried to speak, but his jaw seemed locked. He reached for the water glass already on the table, and that was when the crack finally became a break. His hand didn't just shake, it spasmed. The glass didn't shatter on the floor. It tipped over, the water spilling across the table, soaking into his sleeve and dripping onto the carpet. Julian stared at it, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. It was the look of a man who had finally lost the one thing he valued most: control. I can't," he choked out. The baritone was gone, replaced by a thin, jagged rasp. The restaurant was nearly empty due to the storm, but Andre was already looking over from the bar, his brow furrowed. If Julian Thorne had a public medical episode in the glass house, it would be in the tabloids by midnight. His board would move to replace him by dawn. Clara didn't think. She didn't weigh the $200,000 against his life. She acted. She stepped into the space between him and the rest of the room, blocking him from view. She grabbed a linen napkin and threw it over the spill, then leaned in close, as if she were taking an intimate order. "Lean on me," she commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. "Clara, don't talk, just stand. We're going to the office in the back, now." She reached down and took his arm. He was burning up, a dry, radiating heat that she could feel through his suit jacket. She pulled his arm over her shoulder. He was heavy, solid muscle, and the weight of a man who had carried the world for too long. They moved slowly. To any observer, it looked like a waitress assisting a slightly intoxicated, wealthy patron. But Clara could feel the way his body was failing him. Every few steps his leg would buckle, and she would have to hitch her hip to catch his weight. She could smell the rain on his coat, the expensive cedar of his cologne, and the metallic, sour scent of fear. She bypassed the main kitchen and led him through a side door into a small, private tasting room that was currently unoccupied. She guided him to a velvet armchair and practically dropped him into it. Julian slumped back, his head hitting the wall with a dull thud. His eyes were closed, his chest heaving. The tremor had moved from his hand to his entire right side. Clara locked the door. She went to the sideboard, grabbed a clean cloth, and soaked it in the ice bucket meant for champagne. She came back to him and began to wipe the sweat from his forehead. "Julian, look at me," she said. He opened his eyes. The piercing grey was clouded with pain. "The pills," he whispered. "Right pocket." Clara reached into his pocket. Her fingers brushed against his thigh, a moment of startling intimacy that neither of them acknowledged. She pulled out the small white bottle. She fumbled with the child-proof cap, her own hands shaking now. She got 2 pills out and held them to his lips. He leaned forward, his mouth grazing her palm as he took them. She held a glass of water to his mouth, her hand steadying his as he drank. Minutes passed. The only sound was the rain drumming on the roof and the heavy, rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. Clara stayed where she was, kneeling on the floor between his legs, her hand resting on his knee. She didn't even realize she was touching him until he slowly reached down and covered her hand with his left one, the one that wasn't shaking. His grip was weak, but it was there. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. The medication was starting to work. His voice was regaining some of its resonance. Clara looked at his hand on hers. His skin was pale, the veins tracing intricate patterns across the back of his hand. "I told you," she said, her voice barely audible. "Ghosts see things, and I see that you're not ready to go yet." Julian let out a short, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "Ready? I've spent my whole life being ready for everything. Mergers, lawsuits, deaths. But this, I didn't plan for this. I don't know how to be weak, Clara." "It's not weakness," she said, looking up at him. "It's just being human. Even titans have to bleed eventually." Julian leaned forward, his face inches from hers. The air between them was thick with everything they weren't saying. He looked at her not as a waitress, and not even as a peer in loneliness, but as the only person in the world who truly knew him in this moment. "Who are you?" he asked. It wasn't the casual question from the week before. It was a plea. "You're not just a waitress. I see the way you look at me sometimes. There's a fire in you. It's not just pity." "What is it?" Clara's heart stopped. This was it. She could tell him. She could say, "I am the daughter of the man you killed. I am the girl who watched you take everything, and I have a meeting tomorrow to finish the job." She opened her mouth, the words like glass in her throat. "My name is Clara Martinez," she said. She waited for the name Martinez to register. It was a common name, but in the world of corporate finance 10 years ago, it had been a name associated with the biggest scandal of the year. Julian's brow furrowed. He repeated the name slowly. "Martinez." He searched her face, his eyes darting from her eyes to her mouth. For a second, a flicker of something passed through his gaze, a memory, a ghost of a headline, a girl standing in a doorway. But the medication was making him drowsy. The moment of clarity passed as quickly as it had come. He leaned his head back, his grip on her hand loosening. "Clara," he murmured, his eyes closing. "I'm sorry. I'm so tired." Within minutes, he was asleep. Clara didn't move. She stayed on the floor of the tasting room, the man who had ruined her life sleeping soundly in front of her. She looked at his face in repose. Without the hardness of his ambition, he looked younger, he looked fragile. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the burner phone. She looked at the message from Vanguard. 10:15 sharp. She looked at Julian. Then she looked at her hand, the one he had been holding. She could still feel the phantom warmth of his palm. With a sudden, violent motion, Clara stood up. She walked to the trash can in the corner of the room and dropped the burner phone into it. Then she picked up the champagne bucket and poured the remaining ice water over it, making sure the device was ruined. She wasn't doing it for him, she told herself. She was doing it because she wouldn't let her father's memory be bought with the blood of a dying man. She walked back to Julian and gently shook his shoulder. "Mr. Thorne, Julian, your car is outside. I called Marcus. He's waiting at the service entrance." Julian blinked, his eyes focusing slowly. He looked around the room, then at her. He seemed to remember everything. He stood up, his movements stiff but no longer spasming. He straightened his damp jacket, the mask of the Titan sliding back into place, though it was cracked at the edges. "Thank you, Clara," he said. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a stack of bills. Clara stepped back, her hands behind her back. "No." Julian paused. "It's a tip, a large one. You saved my life tonight in more ways than one." "I don't want your money, Julian," Clara said, her voice hard. "I just want you to remember that the people you don't see, they're the ones who decide whether you fall or stay standing." Julian stared at her for a long time. The silence was heavy with a new kind of tension, not of hate, and not yet of love, but of a profound, unsettling recognition. "I won't forget," he said. He turned and walked out the door, his footsteps echoing in the empty restaurant. Clara stood in the center of the tasting room, the rain still lashing against the windows. She had just thrown away $200,000. She was still in debt. She was still a waitress. But as she walked out to the main floor to finish her shift, she didn't feel like a ghost. For the first time in 10 years, she felt like she was finally haunting the right person. The silence of the morning after the storm was not peaceful. It was heavy, like the air before a second strike of lightning. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap. On the nightstand, a crumpled piece of paper sat under her father's stopped watch. It was a final notice from the bank's collection agency, $200,000. The number seemed to pulsate on the page, a digital heartbeat that was flatlining. She had destroyed the burner phone, but she hadn't destroyed the debt. By saving Julian, she'd essentially signed her own eviction notice. The irony tasted like copper in her mouth. The buzzer to her apartment rang, a harsh, discordant sound that made her jump. She wasn't expecting anyone. Debt collectors didn't usually come in person this early. She walked to the intercom, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who is it?" "It's Marcus, from the restaurant, Mr. Thorne's associate." Clara froze. She hadn't expected to see any part of Julian's world outside the glass walls of the bistro. She pressed the release button and waited in the hallway. Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs, looking wildly out of place in his tailored wool coat against the peeling wallpaper and the smell of boiled cabbage that permeated the building. He was pale, his eyes darting nervously. "Mr. Thorne isn't coming to the restaurant tonight," Marcus said, skipping any greeting. He had another episode this morning, worse than the one last night." Clara felt a cold prickle of dread. "Why are you telling me this?" "Call his doctor." "I did, but he won't see them. He's locked himself in the study. He keeps asking for the ghost." Marcus looked at her with a mixture of confusion and desperation. "He meant you, didn't he? He needs someone to help him finish the Vanguard response. He can't hold the pen, Clara. And he says he doesn't trust me with the final accounts." Marcus held out a black car key. "There's a sedan downstairs. Please, he's losing his grip. And if those Vanguard vultures find out he's incapacitated before the filing deadline at midnight, it's over. Everything he built, everything he's trying to fix, it all goes to them." Clara looked at the key. This was the descent. This was the moment where the line between the waitress and the woman vanished entirely. If she went to his home, she was no longer an observer. She was a participant in his life. "I'm a waitress, Marcus. I don't know anything about corporate filings." "He doesn't need a lawyer," Marcus whispered. "He needs a witness, someone who isn't looking for a payout." Clara took the key. The metal was cold, biting into her palm. Julian Thorne lived in a penthouse that felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum for the living. It was all white marble and floor-to-ceiling glass, perched 50 stories above the city. The wind whistled through the vents, a high-pitched, lonely sound. Clara found him in the study. The room was dark, lit only by the glow of 3 computer monitors and a single desk lamp. The air smelled of stale coffee and the sharp medicinal scent of the pills she had seen the night before. Julian was slumped in a high-backed leather chair. His right arm was tucked into his lap, as if he were trying to hide it. His hair was disheveled, and the sharp lines of his face seemed to have collapsed under the weight of the day. "You came," he said. His voice was a shadow of the baritone that usually commanded boardrooms. "Marcus said you needed a pen," Clara said, stepping into the circle of light. She didn't offer a greeting. She didn't ask how he was. The intimacy was already too high. She needed the armor of her bluntness. Julian gestured with his left hand to a stack of documents on the desk. "Vanguard has moved up the deadline. They've filed a capacity challenge. They're claiming I'm medically unfit to lead the acquisition. They want the board to strip my voting rights by morning." "Are you?" Clara asked, her eyes moving to his hidden arm. "Physically, my body is a traitor," Julian said, a flash of his old bitterness returning to his eyes. "But my mind is still the one that built this empire. I just need to sign the counter-filing, and I need someone to transcribe the final codicil to the Martinez Trust." Clara's breath caught. "The Martinez Trust?" Julian didn't notice her reaction. He was staring at the monitors. "It's a legacy project, something I've been trying to put together for years. It's a restitution. I did things, Clara, in the beginning. I thought they were just numbers. I thought people were collateral damage in the pursuit of efficiency." He looked at her then, his grey eyes searching hers in the dim light. "I destroyed a man 10 years ago, Arturo Martinez. He was a good man, a builder. I broke his company to get to his patents. I thought I was winning. I didn't realize until he was gone that I hadn't won anything. I had just created a hole in the world." Clara felt the room tilt. The walls of the penthouse seemed to press in on her. She reached out and gripped the edge of the mahogany desk to keep from falling. "Why tell me this?" she whispered. "Because I saw his name on your tag," Julian said. "And because when you held my hand last night, I felt like the world was finally stopping its tilt. I've spent 10 years looking for a way to say sorry to a dead man. I thought if I could build a trust, something to find his heirs, to restore what was taken, maybe the tremors would stop." He let out a short, hollow laugh. "They didn't stop. They got worse. I suppose some debts can't be paid with money." Clara looked at the documents. There it was, her father's name, the Martinez Restitution Fund, a multi-million-dollar endowment designed to track down the survivors of the companies Julian had raided. It was the very thing she had dreamed of, justice. But it was coming from the hand of the man who had caused the pain, and it was being offered to her in ignorance. "Sit," Julian commanded softly. "Write what I tell you." For the next 4 hours, they worked in a feverish silence. Clara sat at the desk, her pen flying across the legal pads. Julian paced as much as his legs would allow, dictating the complex financial maneuvers that would shield his assets from Vanguard while simultaneously funding the trust. As the night deepened, the professional distance began to erode. Julian grew tired, his voice dropping to a rasp. He eventually sat on the floor, his back against the glass wall, looking out at the city lights. Clara joined him, sitting a few feet away, her back against the cold marble. "I didn't think I'd end up like this," Julian murmured, looking at his trembling hand. "Alone in a glass box, talking to a waitress about my sins." "I'm not just a waitress, Julian," Clara said. The words felt like they were being dragged out of her. "I know," he said, turning his head to look at her. "You're the girl from the hallway." Clara's heart stopped. The world went silent. "I remembered this evening," Julian whispered, "when I was looking at the Martinez file. I remembered the house in Brooklyn, the piano, and the little girl who stood at the top of the stairs while I walked out the door with her father's life in my briefcase. You have your mother's eyes, Clara, but you have your father's mouth, always set in that line of stubborn pride." Clara couldn't breathe. "You knew all this time at the restaurant?" "Not at first," Julian said, "but the third night, the way you poured the wine, you didn't do it like a servant. You did it like someone who was granting a favor. I recognized the grace, and I recognized the hate. It's a very specific kind of heat, Clara. It kept me warm when the chills started." "Then why?" Clara's voice broke. "Why let me stay? Why give me the secrets? I was going to destroy you, Julian. I had the phone. I had the meeting with Vanguard." Julian reached out with his left hand. This time he didn't just brush her sleeve. He took her hand, his fingers interlocking with hers. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Because I wanted you to do it," he said. "I wanted someone to finally make me pay. But then, you saved me. You threw the phone away. You chose the man over the ghost. And that, Clara, that was a far greater punishment than anything Vanguard could have done." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The scent of him, cedar, rain, and the metallic tang of illness enveloped her. "I'm dying, Clara, and I'm going to spend my last few months trying to be the man your father thought he was. Help me, not for the money, not for the debt. Do it so that when I'm gone, there's something left of us besides the ashes." Clara looked at him, and the last of the hate drained out of her, replaced by a devastating, terrifying love. She realized that they were both broken pieces of the same tragedy. He wasn't the monster, and she wasn't the victim anymore. They were just two people drowning in a sea of gold and regret. "Okay," she whispered, "I'll help you." The moment of peace was shattered by the buzzing of Julian's phone on the desk. It wasn't Marcus. It wasn't the doctor. It was an unknown number. Clara picked it up. Julian nodded for her to answer. "Hello? Clara Martinez?" The voice was cold, professional, and familiar. It was the man from Vanguard. "We know you're at the penthouse. We have the footage of you entering. We also have the original recording of your father's final phone call to Julian Thorne, the one the police never found, the one where Thorne threatens to bury him if he doesn't sign." Clara's hand began to shake. "What do you want?" "We want the counterfiling. Send us a photo of the signature page before he files it at midnight. If you do, the recording goes to the district attorney. Thorne goes to prison for his final months, and your father's name is cleared by a criminal conviction. Revenge, Clara. Real revenge. Not a trust fund built on pity." The man paused. "And we'll pay the $200,000. Consider it a bonus for a job well done." Clara looked at Julian. He was watching her, his face pale, sensing the shift in the air. He didn't know what was being said, but he saw the way she was looking at the documents on the desk. "You have 10 minutes, Clara," the voice said. "Choose the father who loved you or the man who broke him." The line went dead. Clara stood in the center of the room, the weight of 10 years pressing down on her shoulders. The counterfiling was right there. The pen was in her hand. One photo, one text, and the debt was gone. Her father's name was cleared. The ghost would finally be satisfied. She looked at Julian. He looked so small against the backdrop of the city, a dying king in a glass castle. "What was it?" Julian asked, his voice trembling. Clara looked at the signature page. She looked at the man she had come to love in the ruins of her life. "Nothing," she said, her voice like iron. She picked up the counterfiling and walked to the shredder in the corner of the room. "Clara, what are you doing?" Julian stood up, his legs wobbling. "The counterfiling isn't enough," she said, her eyes burning with a sudden fierce light. "If we file that, they'll just keep coming. They have a recording, Julian. They have proof of what you did." Julian went still. "The call." "Yes," Clara said. "But they don't have the rest of it. They don't have the ending." She turned to him, the shredded paper falling like snow around her feet. "We're not going to fight them in court, Julian. We're going to give them exactly what they want. And in doing so, we're going to take everything away from them." The silence that followed the whirring of the shredder was absolute. It was the sound of a bridge burning, the crackle of a decade's worth of legal protection turning into useless confetti. Julian stood by the glass window, his silhouette sharp against the grid of New York City. He looked older, smaller, as if the loss of his legal defense had physically drained him of his stature. "You've just ensured the end of Thorne International," he said. His voice wasn't angry. It was hollow, the sound of a man watching his own funeral from a distance. "Thorne International was built on a lie, Julian," Clara said. She walked toward him, her footsteps soft on the marble. "Vanguard doesn't want your company. They want your blood. They want to use that recording to strip you of everything and leave you in a hospital wing of a federal prison. Is that how you want to be remembered? As a man who was caught?" Julian turned his head slightly. "And what is the alternative, Clara? To walk into that board meeting and hand them the rope to hang me?" "No," Clara said, her eyes burning with a fierce, cold clarity. "We're going to give the rope to the world. We're going to walk into the glass house, the very place where you think you're invisible, and you're going to tell the truth. All of it. Before they can leak the recording, you're going to play it yourself. You're going to announce the Martinez Trust, and you're going to resign. You're going to liquidate every personal asset you have into that fund." Julian let out a dry, rasping laugh. "You're asking me to commit corporate suicide." "I'm asking you to choose your legacy," she countered. "Right now, your legacy is a tremor and a secret. By morning, it could be the man who finally, at the end of his life, chose the girl in the hallway over the numbers on a screen." Julian looked at her for a long time. The tremors in his right hand had moved to his shoulder now, a rhythmic, violent twitch that he could no longer hide. He looked at his hand, then at Clara. He saw the waitress who had held his wrist in the rain. He saw the daughter of the man he'd broken. And for the first time in his adult life, Julian Thorne surrendered. "I'll need help getting there," he whispered. "My legs. They aren't listening tonight." "I've got you," Clara said. The return to the glass house felt like a descent into the heart of a storm. The restaurant was closed to the public for a private emergency session of the board. The brass doors were locked, guarded by men in suits who looked like statues. Clara walked beside Julian, her arm linked firmly with his. She wasn't just supporting his weight, she was providing the rhythm for his steps. Every time his knee faltered, she adjusted her gait, her hip catching his fall before it could begin. To the security guards, it looked like a titan walking with his assistant. To Clara, it felt like carrying a wounded soldier through a minefield. The smell of the restaurant was different without the food. It was sterile, cold, and smelled of expensive floor wax and tension. The board of directors sat around a long mahogany table in the private dining room on the mezzanine. At the head of the table sat Marcus, looking terrified, and next to him were two representatives from Vanguard Holdings, men with shark-like smiles and eyes that never blinked. When Julian entered, the room went silent. "Julian," one of the board members started, his voice dripping with false concern. "We heard you weren't well. We heard there were complications with the filing." Julian didn't sit. He couldn't. If he sat, he might not be able to stand again. He leaned against the back of a heavy leather chair, his left hand gripping the wood so hard his knuckles were white. Clara stood directly behind him, her presence a silent, dark shadow. "The filing is gone," Julian said. His voice was steady, a feat of sheer, agonizing willpower. "I shredded it." A gasp rippled through the room. The Vanguard reps leaned forward, their smiles widening. "Then you've defaulted, Mr. Thorne," the lead rep said. "Under the terms of the challenge, you are required to step down immediately. Unless, of course, you'd like us to play a certain audio file for the SEC. Julian looked at the man. He looked at the room of people who had grown rich off his ruthlessness. Then he looked at Clara. "There's no need," Julian said. He reached into his pocket with his left hand and pulled out a small digital recorder, the one Clara had given him in the car. "I've already sent the recording to the Times. It should be live on their website in 5 minutes, along with my full confession and the terms of my resignation." The Vanguard rep's smile vanished. "You did what?" "I'm liquidating," Julian continued, his voice growing stronger even as his body began to fail. "Every share I own, every property, the penthouse, the planes, the offshore accounts, it's all going into the Martinez Restitution Fund, a trust managed by an independent board to restore the losses of every company I've dismantled in the last 15 years. "You're insane!" a board member shouted. "You're destroying the stock! You're destroying us!" "I'm clearing the ledger," Julian said. He looked at the Vanguard team. "Your leverage is gone. You can't blackmail a man who has already set fire to his own house. I'm no longer the CEO. I'm no longer a billionaire. I'm just a man with a year to live and a very long list of apologies to make." Then Julian did something that made the air leave the room. He reached out and pressed play on the recorder on the table. The room was filled with the sound of a phone line from 10 years ago. A voice, younger and sharper, filled the space. It was Julian's voice. "Listen to me, Arturo. I don't care about your family. I don't care about your legacy. If you don't sign these papers by midnight, I will bury you so deep in litigation, your daughter will be paying off your debts for the next 50 years. I will make sure the name Martinez is synonymous with failure. Sign the papers, or I'll destroy the world you built for her." Then another voice, higher, trembling, but possessed of a quiet dignity. You can take the buildings, Julian. You can take the money, but you can't take the man. I won't sign. I'd rather leave her with nothing but a clean name than a fortune built on your cruelty." The sound of a dial tone followed. Clara felt a sob rise in her throat, a jagged thing that she choked back. Hearing her father's voice, not in a dream, but in the reality of the room, was like being struck by lightning. She looked at Julian. He was staring at the recorder, his face wet with tears. He hadn't just threatened her father, he had threatened her. He had predicted her life of debt 10 years before it happened. "I signed for him," Julian whispered into the silence of the room. "The next morning, I forged his signature. I took it all, and I spent 10 years pretending I hadn't heard the heartbreak on the other end of the line." He turned, his legs finally giving out. He began to collapse, but Clara was there. She caught him, her arms wrapping around his chest, lowering him slowly to the carpeted floor of the restaurant. The board members were shouting. The Vanguard reps were on their phones, trying to mitigate the disaster. The room was chaos, a whirlwind of corporate panic. But on the floor, in the center of the room, there was only silence. Clara held Julian's head in her lap. His tremors were violent now, his whole body racked with a neurological storm. He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers for a forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. "I'm sorry," he gasped, the words barely audible over the din of the room. "Clara, the $200,000, I've paid it, personally, from the fund. You're free. You don't have to be a ghost anymore." Clara looked at him, the man who had ruined her life, and the man who had just destroyed himself to save what was left of her soul. She reached out and brushed the hair from his forehead, her fingers trembling. "The debt was never about the money, Julian," she whispered. "I know," he choked out. "It was about being seen." "I see you," she said, her voice breaking. "I see you, Julian." Outside, the first sirens began to wail, drawing closer to the glass doors of the bistro. The press, the police, the end of the empire, it was all coming. But in the ruins of Table 4, Clara Martinez didn't look at the doors. She looked at the man in her arms, and for the first time in 10 years, she didn't feel the weight of the ashes. She felt the heat of the fire. The air in Montauk did not taste of exhaust or expensive perfume. It tasted of salt, damp cedar, and the cold, honest bite of the Atlantic. 6 months had passed since the glass doors of the bistro had shattered under the weight of the truth, and in that time the world had moved on to newer scandals, louder tragedies, and faster falls from grace. Clara sat on the weathered wooden porch of a small cottage that hugged the shoreline. The house was modest, its paint peeling in places where the sea spray had been particularly unkind, but it was hers, not because of a billionaire's whim, but because for the first time in a decade, her paycheck belonged to her. The $200,000, the phantom limb that had defined her movements for so long, was gone. The Martinez Restitution Fund had settled the accounts, but more importantly, it had settled the score. She held a mug of tea between her palms, the warmth seeping into her skin. Inside the house, she could hear the soft, hesitant notes of a piano. It wasn't the booming, confident music of her childhood. It was slow, sometimes stumbling, as a hand fought against a tremor to find the right key. Julian had found it. He had spent his first month after the collapse, while the lawyers and the press were still circling his carcass, tracking down the specific Steinway that had been hauled out of her father's brownstone 10 years ago. It had ended up in a conservatory in upstate New York. He hadn't bought it for her as a gift. He had bought it for the house, and then told her she was the only person he knew who understood how to listen to it. The music stopped. A moment later, the screen door creaked open. Julian Thorne stepped out onto the porch. He wasn't wearing a charcoal suit. He wore a heavy knit sweater and a pair of trousers that looked lived in. He leaned heavily on a mahogany cane, his right side hitched in a way that would have horrified the man who once commanded boardrooms. His face was thinner, the skin stretched tight over his cheekbones, but the piercing grey of his eyes had softened into something resembling a calm sea. "The C-sharp is sticking," he said, his voice a low rasp that the wind tried to steal. "It's an old piano, Julian," Clara replied, not turning around. "It's allowed to have its quirks." He moved to the chair beside her, a slow and deliberate process that required all of his concentration. When he finally sat, he let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked out at the horizon where the grey water met the grey sky, a seamless transition of infinity. "I saw the news this morning," he said. "The fund finished the distribution for the textile workers in Ohio, the ones from the '08 buyout." "I know," Clara said. "I got the email from Marcus. He says the board is actually starting to enjoy being the good guys. It's a novelty for them." Julian let out a dry, short laugh. "Marcus was always a better man than I gave him credit for. He just needed a reason to stop being afraid of me." He reached out his left hand, the steady one, and rested it on the railing. "And you, Clara, are you still afraid of me?" Clara finally turned to look at him. She looked at the man who had destroyed her father's world and the man who had spent his final year trying to glue the pieces back together. She saw the lines of pain around his eyes and the quiet dignity of a man who had accepted his end. "I was never afraid of you, Julian," she said. "I was afraid of what you represented. I was afraid that if I let go of my hate for you, I'd lose the only thing I had left of my father." "And did you?" Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver watch. She had taken it to a jeweler in the village a week ago. For the first time in 10 years, the second hand was moving, a tiny, rhythmic click, click, click that marked the passage of a future, not just the memory of a past. "No," she said, placing the watch on the table between them. "He's still here, but he's not a ghost anymore. He's just a memory. And memories don't have to be heavy." Julian looked at the watch, then at Clara. The silence between them was no longer the charged, predatory silence of the restaurant or the desperate, feverish silence of the penthouse. It was a shared silence, the kind that exists between two people who have seen the worst of each other and decided that the best was still worth fighting for. "I don't have much longer, Clara," Julian said. It wasn't a plea for pity. It was a statement of fact, as cold and clear as a balance sheet. "The doctors say the next few months will be difficult." "I know," Clara said. "You don't have to stay. You have the money now. You have your name back. You could go anywhere. You could start over." Clara looked at his hand on the railing. She thought about the $200,000. She thought about the double shifts, the smell of lemon wax, and the way she used to count her breaths to keep from screaming. She thought about the man who had held her hand in the rain and told her that she was the only one who truly saw him. She reached out and covered his hand with hers. His skin was cool, but his pulse was steady. "I already started over, Julian," she said. "I started over the night I threw that phone away." She leaned her head back against the chair, closing her eyes and listening to the rhythmic drum of the waves. "My father always said that the measure of a man wasn't what he built, but what he was willing to protect when the storm came. For a long time, I thought he was wrong. I thought building was everything." She opened her eyes and looked at the small cottage, the out-of-tune piano, and the dying man beside her. "But I think I finally understand what he meant. We're not the things we lose. We're the things we save." Julian gripped her hand, his fingers interlocking with hers. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a long amber glow across the water, turning the grey to gold. The story of Julian Thorne and Clara Martinez had begun in a boardroom and a hallway, defined by a crime and a debt. It had moved through the shadows of a high-end bistro and the glass walls of a corporate empire. But it ended here, on a porch that smelled of salt and cedar in the quiet, earned peace of a late November afternoon. Love, Clara realized, wasn't a grand wedding or a rescued fortune. It was the simple, terrifying act of staying when the lights went out. It was the mercy of a daughter and the accountability of a king. As the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, the two of them sat in the gathering cold, watching the tide come in. The weight of the ashes was gone, carried away by the sea, leaving behind nothing but the steady, quiet ticking of a silver watch and the breathing of two souls who had finally found their way home.